Hello, this is Kristy from Quiet Play. Just bringing you a little tutorial on some foundation paper piecing basics, in particular how to make the water lily block from the In the Garden Pattern Club. If you're making the cover quilt, you'll be making 16 of these, so you might as well get in and start practicing before we get to some of the more complex blocks. So this is one I finished earlier, and this is the 7.5 inch version. Today we'll be making the 6-inch version. The only difference is you'll need a little more fabric for the larger version. Otherwise, it's all exactly the same. So first thing you want to do when you print off your templates is make sure they're printed accurately. And that's where this 1-inch square comes into play. So these are printed on the template so that you can measure it by just simply putting your ruler over the top and making sure that it is measured 1-inch square. And that way you'll know your template has printed to size. Then when you print all your templates as you go along, if you always check that 1-inch box, you'll know that they are actual size. It just means when you get to the end, your blocks will finish at the size they're supposed to, and then you can put all your blocks together easily. If you don't check that and your printer magically changes its settings, which they sometimes do, you can end up with some blocks printing at a 1/4 inch smaller, and it just makes it a bit messy. So just take those few seconds, check your 1-inch square, and you're good to go. Now, next thing you'll see, I have my fabrics cut into strips ready to go. So background fabric, I'm using 2 aquas for the petals of the water lily and then the green for the stem. So I've cut mine into strips ready to go. So when I do that, when I first start with a pattern, is I just get my ruler and I loosely measure what I would need. So to work out the background fabric, I look for the biggest square on the template, or not necessarily square, biggest shape, I guess I should say. So that would be this one, is the largest of all the background pieces. And I measure approximately. Now don't forget, you need to go to the seam allowance here and also allow a 1/4 inch seam allowance over the next section. So if I measure that, we're roughly around 3.5 inches. So I've cut my background fabric into a 3.5 inch strip and then it'll fit. So I did that for each of those, and then I cut a longer strip to measure here, which will be 6.5 inches as well for this top one. Now, next, I like to rough cut my fabric into pieces. So I'll show you what that looks like and how I do that. Okay, so I have green fabric, scissors. I'm very low tech when it comes to this. And I eyeball things a lot, and I like to rough cut my pieces. So if I want to cut this stem piece, I just lay my fabric next to it, make sure it goes over the seam allowance on both ends, and then cut. And so that will be my E1. Now I like to cut mine in order and place them in order of the sections I'm making. So then next would be E2, which is the background fabric, which remember I cut to 3.5 inches, so it'll go like that. So I know it'll fit across that way. And then I just need to measure that way, and again, rough cut. And then I place my fabrics in order of piecing. So there's E1, E2, and then I will rough cut E3. Now look, you can be generous with your cutting. It doesn't have to be precise. Some people like to cut them very precisely. I like to rough cut to give myself some wiggle room because sometimes I muck it up. It's really down to a personal preference, and I will say that a lot during this tutorial. So there I have my E section ready to go. So if I just cut my template, and remember, use different scissors. So these are my paper cutting scissors. You don't want to dull your fabric scissors by cutting paper. Now again, some people cut their templates very precisely. I rough cut. I just trim off the extra bits. Just make sure you don't cut any of the template off and you're fine. And then I put it aside with the fabric stacked on top. Sorry, losing my words. Fabrics are stacked on top, ready to sew. And then just toss those away. So what you can do is you can go ahead and do that for all of your sections, or you can just work on one section at a time. I'm going to go ahead and start showing you how to sew because I'm pretty sure you know how to rough cut, and you don't need me to show you for every single piece. So let's start sewing and we'll get on with this. A few little tips before we start. I like to use an open toe foot when I sew. It allows me to see the seams a little better. That's my 1/4 inch foot. It's also great to make sure my seam allowance is correct when I'm joining the sections together. Next is your stitch length. I've dialed mine right down to 1.4. You can sit comfortably at 1.5. I wouldn't go too much smaller because if you have to unpick, it's a bit of a nightmare. The reason we do this is so that when it comes to tearing the paper away from the back of your block, it comes away easier. If you can also use lightweight paper, I actually have some foundation paper piecing paper through Riley Blake Designs, which is quite thin. That's what I've printed this on. I don't know if you can see the difference, but you can see the lines quite easily through the specialty paper. That's on the back side, so you can see it quite clearly when it's held up to the light. Printer paper works just fine. It's just about options. The specialty paper does also tear away more easily, so I can get away with probably a 1.5 stitch length, but it's totally fine on printer paper. Use what you have, no problems there. Okay, let's sew. So I've got my template, I've got my fabrics, my stitch length is dialed down to 1.4 and we're good to go. So we're starting with section E, which is probably one of the easiest out of these ones. Foundation piecing is basically sewing by number. So we're placing fabric for E1, then E2, then E3. E1 is the water lily stem. So your fabric's going to be like that. You need to make sure it is a 1/4 inch seam or on all sides. So we're actually putting our fabric on the back side of the template and you'll be sewing on the printed side. Feels counterintuitive, but you'll get the hang of it. So place your fabric over and you can hold it up to the light to make sure that it is going on all of the sides. Now E2 is going to be the second piece I add. So I'm going to shift this down. So there's my 1/4 inch seam there between E1 and E2. Try to hold it in place. And then I'm going to place my E2 fabric. Now it goes right sides together and we're going to sew on that seam line, and then this fabric will flip open and cover that section. Now you might like to pin this in place just to keep it together while you're moving it underneath. Just put your pin further down away so you're not going to chance sewing over it. So mine's down here and we're going to be sewing on this seam line here between E1 and E2. So put it down underneath the presser foot. I like to backstitch at the beginning and end of my seam. I just feel like it secures it a little more. I don't like to sew into my seam allowance as it makes it harder to remove the paper. That's a personal preference. So I start within the block in the seam allowance, not in the seam allowance rather, backstitch at the beginning and then also at the end. Okay, so there's my seam. We can take that pin out now. There it is on the back. And that's a 1/4 inch already because we lined up our fabrics. Could probably use a little tight, it's a little wonky. Trim your threads as you go. You'll be happy you did that when it comes to it later. Otherwise it makes quite a mess. And I'll just tighten up the seam allowance a bit. All right, so then you're going to open this out and your piece will fit over the background, and here's where your seam was. Now I like to use a finger presser. I use the Clover one and I press my seam open. You can take it over to your iron and press it really well. I just find using the finger presser is quicker and easier. Now you can see my fabric, my E2 section has come all the way to the edges and all the way around, which is exactly what we want. So we're going to do the same now with E3. So have a look at where that seam line is and layer your fabrics again right sides together. Make sure that you're a 1/4 inch over that seam line. You can flick, I flick back and forth a lot to just see to make sure that I've got it lined up. Pin if you want to. I like to live on the wild side and just pop it underneath. Okay, so again, back stitch at the start and end, straight down, super easy, and back stitch. Okay. Now this one will need some trimming because we've got quite a bit of overhang there. So fold your paper away. You don't want to cut your paper template off by accident. Use your fabric scissors and I just eyeball it. Look, you can take this to your mat and use your rotary cutter. I'm a bit of a lazy piecer at times and I'm quite happy to eyeball. Again, personal preference, just like I said, I'll be telling you that quite a bit throughout the tutorial. So cut off that excess. So you can see now I've just got a 1/4 inch. And then we'll put that down, fold it open, and again with the trusty finger presser, smooth that seam down. And that is our section E, done. You can check that it's all over there. Now trim your threads again. These little snips are brilliant for trimming threads like that. I got mine from LDH, I'm a big fan of theirs. So trim that section done, put it aside. So now you need to go ahead and get your templates. Remember, we've still got A through to D to go, and start working on those. I'm going to work on A next because I like to do it in order. Again, rough cut your templates to match. So you'll be doing A1 is water lily, A2 and A3 is background, 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 are petals, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are all background. So you can cut your fabrics, put them in order, ready to sew. All my fabrics ready to go. They're in order. So this will be my A1 section, A2, A3, and so on. I am using the darker aqua for the middle part of the water lily, and then I have the lighter aqua for the petals. So there are a lot more pieces to this one than section E, but it's the exact same thing. So just a quick refresher. I'm not going to do this for all the sections because pretty much once you do it, it's rinse and repeat. So I'm going to place my fabric, you can see against the light, I'm going all the way around and all the way down to the seam. So I'm going to place that there, and I'm even going to try and center that fabric print in the middle there. Okay, so that's A1. A2 is this background piece. So there's our stitch line. We need to make sure that our fabric will be going over there. Oops, that's A3, that one. So I do a lot of flipping back and forth with the paper and moving fabric to line it up. It really comes down to practice and just getting the hang of it. And again, use pins if you need to, or even a dab of glue to hold that first piece of fabric into place on the paper, whatever works for you. So back stitch at the start and at the end. Okay, so it's going to be messy because we didn't have that perfectly lined up. So fold your paper back and trim that 1/4 inch seam. Sorry about the lighting. Okay, like that. Open out your section. Smooth it with your fingers or your finger presser or your iron. Mini irons could be really good for this too. So, and there we have the first piece. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the piecing, which you can do the same. It's going to be the same for all of the templates, just add them together. Then we'll come back and chat about how we are going to trim up the templates and join the sections together. I just thought I wanted to jump back in while we're still talking about piecing, because there is a little slightly tricky bit in the bottom of the water lily where you have angled sections to join. Now with this, really make sure your fabric pieces are quite generous, because when you put it over here, it needs to go all the way up to the seam allowance there. So it's actually a lot longer than just that section. When you add it on, so this is for section D4, place it across the seam allowance. But when you look at this, see how I've got it well either side, because when you flip that fabric, it needs to cover up into this point. So you want quite a bit of extra. So you can see, you can do a little practice flip along that seam allowance there. And just kind of flip it and just check. So just hold it in place at a rough one to make sure that it's going to cover that bit. Otherwise, there's nothing worse than you flip a piece of fabric over and suddenly you realize it's not going to fit. And you either have to unpick or you have to do a little bit of surgery and add that extra piece. So just make sure it's quite generous on this extra bit to cover that point when you add it on. Okay, so that's sort of a bit of a trick when it comes to some of these angled pieces. The rest of it's as you normally piece it with foundation piecing, but sometimes the angles can be tricky. I'm going to finish piecing this. It's my last section. All the others here are ready to go. And then I'm going to give them all a good press with the iron, and then we'll chat about trimming them up. All my sections are pieced. I'm just going to give them a good press. I just wanted to chat about when you iron them. You press your pieces into place like you normally would with any sort of patchwork. But one thing to keep in mind is, because you've got the print on the back, I recommend using a dry iron. If you use steam, while it works beautifully, it can possibly make your ink run on your printed templates. So I tend to use a dry iron, and if you need it, you can always use starch if you have a particularly difficult block that doesn't want to sit flat. It's probably more key when you're joining the sections. For this part, you shouldn't really need starch, but you just need to give them a really good press so that all the sections lay flat. So you've used the finger presser, which will hold them into place, but there's nothing like giving it a good hot press with the iron. Trimming time. So you forgive my really hideously dirty mat. Because I do a lot of foundation piecing, I have a dedicated mat just for cutting paper, batting, all that sort of thing. Same with my rotary cutter. I have two cutters, one that I use for when I'm trimming up foundation piecing, and then one that I use just for fabric. Same with the mats. Obviously this isn't necessary, but foundation piecing is what I do. So for me, it is a bit of a necessity. All right, so we're going to trim up our blocks. They're pretty scruffy, messy. We need to trim back to our seam allowance, which is the outside line. Don't trim to the inside line, otherwise you've got no seam allowance. Cause you all sorts of problems. So line up your template. It should be exactly, your ruler. Should be exactly 1/4 inch, and just trim off the edges. So you're going to do that for all of your templates. Now you'll see, particularly on these triangle ones, there are little corners that you can cut there. You can do that if you want to. Sometimes it will help you line up when you're joining your templates together. Sometimes the program that I use, EQ8, to design my foundation piece patterns, can get a little extra enthusiastic and add these corners in. And if you trim them, sometimes you end up with like a little gap in your fabric, and that drives me a bit bonkers. So I tend to wait until I'm joining the sections together and see if I need the extra guidance on how I'm going to put them together. Otherwise, you can just kind of ignore them. It's a personal preference. Again, I told you I'd say that a lot, right? So you can do that and experiment and see if that works for you, having all the corners trimmed, or you can go without, and then you just have to trim maybe a few extra dog ears as you go along down the track. But I think we're pretty used to doing that in patchwork anyway, so it's not really a big deal. So you're just going to go ahead, trim all the rest of the templates. Oh, see, I need to change my blade. It's catching on a few threads. That's the only thing when you have a dedicated one like this, it does tend to wear out. What I do too, if you decide you want a dedicated blade because you're going to be a foundation piecing fanatic like me, once my blade in my good cutter for fabric starts to dull, I will switch that out and put it into this one to trim up my scraps. And that's how I came about with this mat too. I didn't go out and specifically buy a mat to use just for this. It was my original mat that my mum bought for me when I first started quilting 10 years ago. And it became quite scruffy and a bit beyond what it should be. So I just use it now. I actually have two mats on my cutting table. I have quite a big cutting table. And I just keep this one on this side. And then anytime I have to trim anything up that's a bit, messy, like if I'm cutting up minky fabric, or if I'm cutting batting or anything like that, or like this, a whole heap of paper, I just use this one. Now with these ones, I'm only using my 6.5 inch ruler, and the blocks are 6.5 inch. So if you trim down the sides, which I should have done on the other blocks, but never mind, it'll make it just that little bit smaller and less unwieldy to sort of move your cutter around. And this is the part where I start getting excited with foundation piecing, because you're starting to see how it's going to look when you put it together. It's a bit like a puzzle sometimes when you're doing foundation piecing, because it's all in such little sections and they look a bit random, and you kind of think, how the heck does that go together? But you get to this part where you trim it up and they're all tidy again, and you go, there's my block. So if we start just laying it out to give us a bit of an idea, you can use the picture in the pattern to help you figure out where it goes together. I've made this block so many times that it's sort of become second nature now. And you can sort of see where it fits. Now you can see these bits look bigger. Remember, they had the little edgy corners. They will fit in, plus you have to factor in your seam allowance. So right now it's not quite there yet, but we're pretty close. I'll take you over, we will sew it together, and I'll start showing you how we join the sections, ready to finish your block. Now I have my block laid out in order off screen, just like what I showed you on the cutting mat. I like to do that so that I can see what I'm doing when I'm putting it together and have a bit of an idea. The instructions are included in the assembly instructions, and it'll say things like A plus B, B plus C. So that's where our template pieces come into place. So section A, section B. So to join them together, that's going to sit there. Now here's where I like to trim the corners just a bit. I like to trim the ones that are going to line up in the middle, so just on the one side. So I will just trim that one, just on the inside ones, because then it'll be tidy when I join it. So see, it'll fit like that. All right, so flip it over, right sides together. Now this is where the trimming will help you line it up. See how that just fits nicely now onto that back piece. Can you see that? Then you can pin it again if you want to, or just go wild and put it under and hope for the best. That tends to be my method. Okay, so they're lined up together. Paper is still on so that you know where to sew. Again, back stitch at the beginning and end for security, and then it's just stitching along that seam, and that's quite easy. And this will keep all your pieces nice and tidy, like all the seam line bits that we've already joined together. Okay. Trim your threads as you go, so much easier. The other thing to do as you go when you're joining is this skinny strip right here, that's caught in your seam allowance. So fold it over, this paper bit, and just pull it out now. Trust me, do it now, it's so much easier. And remember, you've got two sides, so do both and pull it out like that. Okay, open out your block. All right, again, I use the finger presser here. You don't have to, only if you want to. We are actually going to iron as we go any sections before they're joined. Like when we join this, the next section down here, that'll be affected by that seam join, so it needs an iron. However, I can add this seam piece because it's all nice and flat and ironed. Again, I'm going to trim those inner corners just to help me line up a bit better. Now you can see, oh, look at that. I've missed a tiny bit here. Now, if that happens to you, don't freak out because it's covering the actual seam line. It's just, I'm a bit short on the seam allowance. Not the end of the world. If you are worried about it, you can add a little bit of fabric on there and you'll just have an extra seam. No one will really notice unless you point it out. So just don't tell them, it's fine. All right, so I've lined that up. Join it in. Sorry for the wobbling of the camera. Okay, so with the skinny seams, here's part of the reason why I don't like to sew into the seam allowance. If I had sewn into the seam allowance, it would have gone here, and so then ripping this out is even more fiddly than it should be because you'd have lots of extra seams through it. And it's just not necessary. If you backstitch, you don't need to be sewing into your seam allowances. But like I said, personal preference. If you want to sew into your seam allowances, go nuts. I'm not going to judge you. All right, so that section's together. Now we are going to join section D and section E together. Okay, this one's super easy because it's two rectangles and it goes straight across. I'm just going to match that up the top there on both ends. Place it under the presser foot. Just keep an eye on it as you sew that it doesn't shift. Now, the other thing you can use along with pins is Clover Wonder Clips. They're quite good to hold it in place as well. Just go, again, remember what I'm going to say, personal preference, do what works for you. All right. So they're my sections joined together. So now I have done D and E, and the top half is A, B, C. And so then the next part in the instruction says to join A, B, C to D, E. But first, before you do that, iron your sections so that they are nice and flat. Okay, because see right now they're a bit bumpy. So I'm going to pop over and press that down. When you do it, press your seam to the section that has least seams. So this seam's going to press down to E. This one, they're pressing down to B and C. Okay, my sections are pressed. You can see my seams are sitting nice and flat now. Press on the back, press on the paper. This is why I don't like to use steam, because you are pressing on the paper in this section and you don't want that ink to run and potentially spoil your fabric. Press on the back and then flick it over and give it a nice press on the front. So we're joining A plus B to D, sorry, A, B, C plus D, E. Really helps to know your alphabet. Super simple again, because we're just joining the rectangles. You've done the hard part with the angles on the water lily. Again, back stitch at the beginning and end. Just keep making sure you've lined it up. Sometimes your piece might go a little, oh sorry, that's very wobbly. Might go a little wonky when you sew. So you need to just guide it as you go. All right, and guess what? That is our block pieced, my friends. You only have 15 more to go. You can do it, right? Okay, remember, skinny strips out, trust me. So much easier if you do it now. Now, I like to leave the rest of the papers in my blocks until I'm ready to join them all together. I feel like that adds a bit of stability. And then you can either remove the papers before you put all the blocks together, or you can put all the blocks together and remove the paper after, your choice. But there's our block. Whoops. See why I need to give it a press? I will be right back. And that's our block put together. So give it a good press front and back. And you can see I've pressed all my seams in the same direction. That just minimizes the bulk when they're joined together. And notice the threads are trimmed. Do that now, it'll save you so much time later. So this is a 6-inch block. That means it's 6 inches finished, which means that's the size when it's added into a quilt. This actual physical one sitting right here will be 6.5 inches, which is the unfinished size, and that includes your 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides. So that's your 6-inch block. And for comparison, there's the 7.5 that I'd made previously. And I forgot to mention fabrics as well. So in this one, these are all Riley Blake Designs fabrics. This is Hush Hush, this background on this one, which is a low volume collection for Riley Blake. And this is my particular print called Rainbow Scatter with the little rainbow stars in it. I used prints from Dream, which is my current collection out now, to make the water lily, and a confetti cottons green for the stem. And this one is by Heather Peterson called Indigo Garden, and her Instagram is Anchor's Treasures. She has beautiful fabrics, also for Riley Blake, and I'm making a quilt with her Indigo Garden one. But I figured I would use Dream for our example one to show you what it would look like. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea of what you need to do. If you're making the cover quilt for the Pattern Club, like I said, you're going to be making 16 of these. So I hope you have fun planning them out. Make sure you use the colouring page. These would look great in like this one with a single fabric. It looks good with 2, or you can even put in 3, one for the middle, one for the outer, and one for the bottom. Go nuts, you can have a lot of fun playing around with these. So I hope you enjoy this little intro to foundation piecing. And if you have any questions, let me know. And I hope you have fun sewing them.